A codex is a book constructed of a number of sheets of paper, vellum, papyrus, or similar materials, with handwritten content. The book is usually bound by stacking the pages and fixing one edge, and using a cover thicker than the sheets. Some codices are continuously folded like a concertina. The alternative to paged codex format for a long document is the continuous scroll. Examples of folded codices include the Maya codices. Sometimes people use the term for a book-style format, including modern printed books but excluding folded books. The Romans developed the form from wooden writing tablets. The codex is gradual replacement of the scroll. The dominant book form in the ancient world has been called the most important advance in bookmaking. Before the invention of printing, the codex transformed the shape of the book itself, and offered a form that lasted for centuries. The spread of the codex is often associated with the rise of Christianity, which adopted the format for use with the Bible early on. First described by the 1st century AD Roman poet Martial, who praised its convenient use. The codex achieved numerical parity with the scroll around AD 300, and had completely replaced it throughout the now Christianized Greco-Roman world by the 6th century. Origins. The codex provides considerable advantages over other book formats: compactness, sturdiness, economic use of materials by using both sides, eyes of reference. The change from rolls to codices roughly coincides with the transition from papyrus to parchment as the preferred writing material, but the two developments are unconnected. In fact, any combination of codices and scrolls with papyrus and parchment is technically feasible and common in the historical record. The codex began to replace the scroll almost as soon as it was invented. In Egypt, by the 5th century, the codex outnumbered the scroll by 10 to 1 based on surviving examples. By the 6th century, the scroll had almost vanished as a medium for literature. Technically, even modern paperbacks are codices, but publishers and scholars reserve the term for manuscript books produced from late antiquity until the Middle Ages. The scholarly study of these manuscripts from the point of view of the bookbinding craft is called codicology. The study of ancient documents in general is called paleography. History. The Romans used precursors made of reusable wax-covered tablets of wood for taking notes and other informal writings. Two ancient polyptychs, a pentathic and octothic, excavated at Herculaneum, used a unique connecting system that presages later sewing on of thongs or cords. Julius Caesar may have been the first Roman to reduce scrolls to bound pages in the form of a notebook, possibly even as a papyrus codex. At the turn of the 1st century AD, a kind of folded parchment notebook called pugiles membranae in Latin became commonly used for writing in the Roman Empire. This term was used by the classical Latin poet, Martial. Martial used the term for gifts of literature that Romans exchanged during the festival of Saturnalia. According to T.C. Skeat, in at least 3 cases and probably in all, in the form of codices, and he theorized that this form of notebook was invented in Rome and then must have spread rapidly to the Near East. In his discussion of one of the earliest parchment codices to survive from Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, Eric Turner seems to challenge Skeat's notion when stating, its mere existence is evidence that this book form had a prehistory, and that early experiments with this book form may well have taken place outside of Egypt. Early codices of parchment or papyrus appear to have been widely used as personal notebooks. For instance, in recording copies of letters sent, the parchment notebook pages were commonly washed or scraped for reuse, and consequently, writings in a codex were often considered informal and impermanent. As early as the early 2nd century, there is evidence that a codex, usually of papyrus, was the preferred format among Christians. In the library of the Villa of the Papyri, Herculaneum, all the texts are scrolls. However, in the Nag Hammadi library, hidden about AD 390, all texts are codices. Despite this comparison, a fragment of a non-Christian parchment Codex of Demosthenes, the false legation from Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, demonstrates that the surviving evidence is insufficient to conclude whether Christians played a major or central role in the development of early codices, or if they simply adopted the format to distinguish themselves from Jews. The earliest surviving fragments from codices come from Egypt, and are variously dated towards the end of the 1st century or in the first half of the 2nd. This group includes the Rylands Library Papyrus P52, containing part of St. John's Gospel, and perhaps dating from between 125 and 160. In Western culture, the Codex gradually replaced the scroll. Between the 4th century, when the Codex gained wide acceptance, and the Carolingian Renaissance in the 8th century, many works that were not converted from scroll to Codex were lost. The Codex improved on the scroll in several ways. It could be opened flat at any page for easier reading. Pages could be written on both front and back, and the protection of durable covers made it more compact and easier to transport. The ancients stored codices with spines facing inward, and not always vertically. The spine could be used for the incipit, before the concept of a proper title developed in medieval times. Though most early codices were made of papyrus, papyrus was fragile and supplies from Egypt, the only place where papyrus grew and was made into paper, became scanty. The more durable parchment and vellum gained favor, despite the cost. The codices of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica had the same form as the European Codex, but were instead made with long folded strips of either fig bark or plant fibers, often with a layer of whitewash applied before writing. New World codices were written as late as the 16th century. Those written before the Spanish conquest seem all to have been single long sheets folded concertina style, sometimes written on both sides of the local AMATL paper. In East Asia, the scroll remained standard for far longer than in the Mediterranean world. There were intermediate stages, such as scrolls folded concertina style and pasted together at the back, and books that were printed only on one side of the paper. Judaism still retains the Torah scroll, at least for ceremonial use. From scrolls to codex. Among the experiments of earlier centuries, scrolls were sometimes unrolled horizontally, as a succession of columns. This made it possible to fold the scroll as an accordion. The next step was then to cut the folios, sew and glue them at their centers, making it easier to use the papyrus or vellum recto verso as with a modern book. Traditional book binders would one of these assembled, trimmed and curved folios a codex to differentiate it from the case, which we now know as hardcover. Binding the codex was clearly a different procedure from binding the case. Preparing a codex. The first stage in creating a codex is to prepare the animal skin. The skin is washed with water and lime, but not together, and it has to soak in the lime for a couple of days. The hair is removed and the skin is dried by attaching it to a frame called a hearse. The parchment maker attaches the skin at points around the circumference. The skin attaches to the hearse by cords. To prevent tearing, the maker wraps the area of the skin the cord attaches to around a pebble called a pippin. After completing that, the maker uses a crescent-shaped knife called a lunarium or lunellum to clean any surviving hairs. Once the skin completely dries, the maker gives it a deep clean and processes it into sheets. The number of sheets from a piece of skin depends on the size of the skin and the final product dimensions. For example, the average calf skin can provide 3.5 medium sheets of writing material. This can be doubled when folded into two conjoint leaves, also known as a bifolium. Historians have found evidence of manuscripts where the scribe wrote down the medieval instructions now followed by modern membrane makers. Defects can often be found in the membrane, whether from the original animal, human error during the preparation period, or from when the animal was killed. Defects can also appear during the writing process. Unless it is kept in perfect condition, defects can appear later in the manuscript's life as well. Preparation of the pages for writing. First, the membrane must be prepared. The first step is to set up the quires. The quire is a group of several sheets put together. Raymond Clemens and Timothy Graham point out, in Introduction to Manuscript Studies, that the quire was the scribe's basic writing unit throughout the Middle Ages. They note, pricking is the process of making holes in a sheet of parchment in preparation of it ruling. The lines were then made by ruling between the prick marks, the process of entering ruled lines on the page to serve as a guide for entering text. Most manuscripts were ruled with horizontal lines that served as the baselines on which the text was entered, and with vertical bounding lines that marked the boundaries of the columns, forming the quire. The scribe, usually a monk, decided what his quire would look like by arranging the hair and flesh sides of the sheets. From the Carolingian period and all the way up to the Middle Ages, different styles of folding the quire came about. For example, in mainland Europe throughout the Middle Ages, the quire was put into a system in which each side folded onto the same style. The hair side met the hair side and the flesh side to the flesh side. This was not the same style used in the British Isles, where the membrane was folded so that it turned out an 8-leaf quire, with single leaves in the 3rd and 6th positions. The next stage was tacking the quire. Tacking is when the scribe would hold together the leaves in quire with thread. Once threaded together, the scribe would then sew a line of parchment up the spine of the manuscript, as to protect the tacking.